He goes to Herbert Hoover, the former president, and he says, "What did I say that was wrong?" And Hoover says, "It's not that what you said was wrong. You were simply wrong to say it, because you've taken yourself to a place that is politically out of bounds." And in fact, the America First Committee then distanced itself from Lindbergh, and very shortly, the American First Committee has to disband.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. I welcome Professor H.W. Bill Brands. His new book, America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh, in the Shadow of War. It is April 1939. A young man is exiting a transatlantic steamer, and he's greeted by what appear to be a football team of flashbulbs popping as he walks off. The police form a barrier for him to get off the ship. His name is Charles Lindbergh, Lucky Lindy, and he remarks in his diary, and I have this thanks to the professor, that the bulbs were popping so fast and they were smashing to the ground that it was like walking across glass. The excitement here is because of events in Europe and events in the United States that are about to lead to a huge controversy based on the understanding of not going to war again as we did in 1917, because the American people resented what they'd been told the war was for, the war to end all wars, the war to save democracy, and the results had been the usual colonial empires battling each other for regions and space and resources in Europe, while America went home in grief. Professor, congratulations. This is an incredibly rich story with all kinds of connections about America and its reluctance to get involved in European wars. Lindbergh, at this point, he's 37 years old, and he's world famous. Why? What is it that they're still celebrating about him 12 years after the Spirit of St. Louis flew the Atlantic in a solo flight? Good evening to you.
Well, thank you. So the reason that Lindbergh was famous in 1939 is precisely for what he did in 1927. The world had never heard of Charles Lindbergh until, out of the night, he landed his plane in Paris, and he had flown the Atlantic. This was the technological feat of the era. I liken it to the landing on the moon in the 1960s. And Lindbergh was to the 1920s and early 1930s what astronauts were in the 1960s and early 1970s. These were people, these were men who had technical proficiency. They were smart, obviously, but they were brave as well. And they had dared to do things that had never been done before. So when Lindbergh flew out of the night into Paris, and he was surrounded by floodlights and surrounded by people, he was immediately embraced by the French people. He was this hero. He was a world celebrity. He might very well have been the most famous American in the world as a result of this. And he had just the personality for it. He was not boastful. He seemed to be sort of modest and shy. He was well-spoken. It helped that he was good looking. He was the kind of young man that every mother and father would say, boy, we hope our sons grow up to be like that. And during the period from 1927, getting us up to 1939, he had remained in the spotlight partly against his will. He married into a wealthy banking family with the House of Morgan. But the thing that really riveted the attention of the world was in the early 1930s when his and his wife's infant son was kidnapped and murdered. And it seemed to be this horrible thing that had happened to this very admirable person. And it became the focus of attention. It was called the crime of the century, and it gave rise to the trial of the century. The fact that this was in the early days of television, of movie newsreels was really important, because for the first time, people on movie screens, when they go to the movies on Saturday, they could see Lindbergh and see what he was doing in the courtroom. And we would call the people who followed him around, the photographers that you referred to, we might call them paparazzi today. But basically, these were people who wanted to get the photographs of this famous guy. Their pestering of Lindbergh became so annoying that he took his family and moved to England to get out of the spotlight. And the moment you referred to is when he's coming back, when he and his wife, they're coming back in 1939, because it looks like Europe is about to go to war. And Lindbergh realizes that if there's a war on, he needs to be back in America.
The walking over of the broken bulbs immediately reminded me, and his diary is extremely well written, but he didn't connect it. So I'm going to connect it. Kristallnacht, November of 38. He was in Paris when Kristallnacht happened. He then was in Berlin trying to puzzle through what has happened to the German people who are so neat and so organized. He's been in England, but he's been studying the deterioration of conditions in Europe. What is his thinking as he arrives back in America? What does he make of what he left behind in Britain and in France and in Germany?
Lindbergh had a stubborn admiration for German culture. He thought the Germans knew how to do things right, and he was quite dismayed at this strange and alarming turn that German politics had taken. So he did not know what to make of Kristallnacht. He did not know what to make of Adolf Hitler. He did not know what to make of the rise of the Nazi Party and the apparent obvious embrace by the German people of these strange new movements. So this puzzled him. He was very discouraged about the British and Britain's approach to world affairs, because he thought Britain at one time had been a great country, but it had allowed itself to fall into complacency and apathy. And this seemed to be marked by the fact that the British and the French had established this post-war regime at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. And they had imposed these restrictions on Germany, which were unrealistic at the time, as almost everybody realized. And then they refused to enforce them afterwards. So it was as though the British thought that they could continue to cruise on the momentum that their empire had had in the 19th century. But Lindbergh thought that Britain's day was behind it. Its great time was behind it. And this was why he was so puzzled at the policy of the British, that they made these demands of Germany. They said, you must do this. They made promises to Czechoslovakia, which they didn't follow through on, and then to Poland. And he was afraid that, okay, well, they're going to be called upon to fulfill the promise of the guarantee of security to Poland, but they're not going to be able to do it. And the result is that Hitler will call their bluff and Europe will be at war. And the British, Lindbergh strongly suspected, they will look to the United States to bail them out the second time, the way the United States had bailed out the British in World War I.
Immediately, he's in Washington, beckoned to meet with the President of the United States after visiting with Hap Arnold, the head of the Army Air Corps, and also exchanging glances, I believe, with General Marshall and the Secretary of War, Mr. Woodring. But he's with the President, I believe, for the first time, because he notes in his diary, a carefully written diary, wonderful to have this document, that he realizes the President is disabled, but cheerful and charming. Why does FDR want to see him so quickly? Why is FDR so charming and convincing? What does he want from him?
Lindbergh is still one of the most celebrated Americans. So he had a following simply because he was Charles Lindbergh. He also had great and detailed knowledge of the aircraft, especially the military aircraft of the world. He had helped design his own plane in flying across the Atlantic, and he had kept up on the state of aircraft technology. Whenever he would visit a foreign country, the people who made the airplanes, especially the Air Corps, the Air Forces, would invite him to come look at their planes. And they'd pick his brain and say, well, what can we do to improve them? And so he knew what the air fleet of France was like. He knew what the air fleet of Britain was like, that of Russia, of Germany, of Japan. And so, of course, the people in the War Department in Washington, they wanted to know what he knew. He wasn't an official air attaché, but he was, in effect, an unofficial air attaché. He still had a commission as a colonel in the Army Air Corps Reserve. And so he was essentially obliged to check in when he would come back. And so he goes to Washington to go to the War Department, and then he's invited to the White House. And Franklin Roosevelt wants to bring him in because Lindbergh's comments that Lindbergh had made to people like Joseph Kennedy in Britain, the American ambassador in Britain at the time, gave Roosevelt cause to believe that Lindbergh might be skeptical of American policy, especially as skeptical of what Lindbergh supposed would be pressure to diminish America's neutrality and take the side of Britain and France should a war break out. And Roosevelt wanted to essentially co-opt Lindbergh by bringing him into the administration, figuring that if he was inside the tent, he would be easier to control than if he were outside the tent. And Lindbergh realized this. He realized, in fact, in a short space of time, he finds Roosevelt charming in this meeting, but he realizes that this is a charm that Roosevelt can put on. And he talks about how he understands how Roosevelt can charm people. And there's part of Lindbergh that is refusing to be charmed. But in particular, he's refusing to accept the offer to come into the administration because Lindbergh was very jealous of his own independence, his ability to speak his mind without feeling obligated to anybody else. And this would be a characteristic of his position during this whole period. And so he declines to join the Roosevelt administration. He realizes that Roosevelt will be trying to move the United States toward siding with Britain and France should a war break out. Lindbergh doesn't want to have any part of it.
The book is America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. H.W. Brands, Professor Brands, the author. The summer of 39, the deterioration on the continent is obvious from great distance in America. Lindbergh watches it in despair. However, the events are tumbling, and when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is made, it's clear that war is imminent. What will happen is that the Hitlerites attack Poland from the east, and within weeks, the communists, the Marxists, the Leninists, the Stalinists attack Poland from the west, and the country is no more. It is destroyed. The response to that is various in America. Mr. Roosevelt immediately uses the word neutrality. He has to because there's been a neutral decision made by Congress to maintain neutrality in the event of war anywhere. There's been a war going on in Asia since at least 32, the Japanese tearing up China. However, it's Lindbergh's reaction that is is freshest because he goes on the radio. Why does he do that, Professor? Why does a modest man who values solitary flight at 5,000 feet over the wilderness take to the national radio?
It's something that I wrestled with in writing this book because Lindbergh says again and again, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this, but he does it again and again. So is he being perfectly honest with himself? Is there some aspect of the fame, the notoriety that comes from being Charles Lindbergh that he values? Well, he certainly values it in the sense that it gives him a platform. He is, in essence, a private figure. But when he calls up the Mutual Broadcasting System and CBS and other networks and says, I want to give a radio talk, they give him airtime. An ordinary person couldn't do this, but Charles Lindbergh could because there would be an audience. And so the broadcast would attract sponsors and would pay for itself. So he decides he needs to do this because Lindbergh's father had been a member of Congress and he had been opposed to American intervention in the First World War. And he had fallen afoul of the Sedition Act of the First World War. And he had been driven out of politics for his, what he thought were his independent views. And Lindbergh took two things from this. One is that he didn't want to go into politics for himself. He didn't want to put himself up for election. He didn't want to deal with that part of it. He thought that politics was a mean business. It was low. You could expect people in politics not to tell the truth. If they did tell the truth, it was by accident or it would take you by surprise. So he didn't want to do that. He valued his independence and his ability to speak his mind freely. But he also took from that it had been a grave mistake for the United States to get involved in war the first time. So the best read that I have on this, and of course I'm reading Lindbergh's diary, and people, are they always entirely honest in their diary? Who knows? But he certainly wanted to keep the United States from making the same mistake the second time it had made the first mistake. He thought that when Germany invades Poland and then Britain and France declare war on Germany, that they're setting things up, they're launching a war they can't win, they're not ready to fight, and they will turn to the United States to bail them out. And he thought it had been a mistake the first time around. He thought that America was lucky to pull back from Europe during the 1920s and 1930s. He thought, he predicted again and again that if the United States went into Europe a second time, there would be no getting out. The United States would be in Europe for good.
The radio on 9:15, the radio again on 10:13, but meeting dignitaries of the age in between and around this period. He sits with Herbert Hoover in his New York apartment, and Hoover suggests to him forming a committee, which will eventually presciently become the America First Committee. He also visits the House of Morgan, as you call it correctly, because he's married into it by his wife, Anne. And J.P. Morgan himself, Jr., comes out and greets him in 23 Wall Street. Most significant to me is the observation of a man named Nicholson, who is a host and a friend of his from England, an Englishman. He calls him a schoolboy. What does that mean? Meeting all these dignitaries, all grown-ups. Why is a schoolboy what Mr. Nicholson, who likes him, why is that his opinion? We have a couple of minutes.
Yeah, so the British looked on Lindbergh as, okay, he seems to be this talented young man, but he's riding on the fame that he gained before he was 30 years old. And it was for his feet in an airplane. What does he know about diplomacy? What does he know about governing a great empire? And from the British point of view, that's a critical thing. It's not simply democracy, it's this empire that they've got to govern. And they thought that entirely too much attention was being paid to Lindbergh because he seemed to be a novice. He had, well, as Nicholson puts it, he had the views that one would find in a schoolboy. And one would have hoped, says Nicholson, that he would have matured and realized that the world is more complicated than this. Now, of course, British commentators, they're looking at this from the perspective of their country is at war and they want all the help they can get. And Lindbergh is trying to convince Americans that they should not go to Britain's help. So there's a certain angle that the British view Lindbergh from. And he's aware of this, and he's quite willing to say, they have their view. If I were British, I might very well feel the same way, but I'm not. I'm an American, and America's interests in this fight are different from the interests of Britain.
The decision is made to remain neutral, but FDR makes it very clear at this point. We don't have all of the correspondence that FDR has been engaged in 6.5 years, that neutrality needs to be adjusted. So when we come back, Congress gets involved, and so does the debate over what kind of neutrality. The book is America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. H.W. Brands is the author. Poland's cut up. The people of the Bloodlands are massacred. Some of this is known. It's generally understood that the Hitlerites are hostile, but then again, so are the Stalinists. This is the part of the war where Germany and Russia seem to be cooperating. However, watching this from America, FDR knows that he needs to adjust the Neutrality Act. And he's in correspondence with the man who's become the first Lord of the Admiralty again, whom we all know as the hero of the Second War, Winston Churchill. However, the relationship between FDR and Winston Churchill is transactional. They both want something from each other. And they carry on a correspondence beginning 1940, early in 1940, while Roosevelt is trying to convince Congress to let him adjust the Neutrality Act. I'm interested in how Lindbergh was viewing all this. He's visiting with senior members of Congress, some very famous senators, Burton Wheeler, Gerald Nye, Robert Borer himself, for heaven's sakes, the man who connects us to TR. What are the senators telling him? What do they want from him, Professor?
Well, the first thing that they're telling him is don't trust Roosevelt. They didn't trust Roosevelt. They believed that Roosevelt was saying one thing while aiming to do something else. So, upon the outbreak of war, Roosevelt requests that Congress modify the neutrality legislation. I should add here that Congress had passed a series of laws starting in 1935 to prevent exactly those steps that had led gradually the United States into war the first time around. So, for example, selling weapons to belligerents, making loans to the belligerents, American nationals sailing on the ships of belligerents. And each one of those contributed to America's entry into the First World War. So Congress wrote a series of laws saying you can't do that. And so you can't sell weapons to the belligerents, because the first go-round during World War I, selling weapons to the British and the French gradually drew the United States into that side. So when Roosevelt speaks about neutrality at the beginning of the war, this is September 1939, he has no choice. Congress has said the United States is neutral, but what Roosevelt wants to do is to modify the neutrality. Now he says that he wants to modify the neutrality so that the United States will not have to get involved in the war. He wants the British and the French to be able to defend themselves better than they're doing at the moment. This is what he says, and he makes his case. Lindbergh and the other critics of Roosevelt that you mentioned, they believe that Roosevelt is simply preparing the way for further intervention on behalf of Britain and France. And step by step, they say, and Lindbergh believes, Roosevelt is trying to lead the United States toward this end that he has already determined upon, that the United States, under Franklin Roosevelt's leadership, will step onto the world stage and will establish a new order in Europe. And so every time Roosevelt says, that's not what I'm doing, no, I'm trying to keep the United States out of the war. If we send weapons to Britain and France, we won't have to send troops to Britain and France. Lindbergh says, I don't believe it. And the other anti-interventionists, who were all critics of Roosevelt, they were mostly Republicans of the opposite party. And so they didn't trust Roosevelt, and Lindbergh didn't either.
85 years later, we're in a place where we can say they're both right and they're both wrong simultaneously. It's one of the compelling parts of the professor's book. You find statements that you agree with, and then the other side makes a statement you agree with, and you're lost. So imagine being the American people listening to this play out on the radio. All right, we have, again, remarks by FDR associating people who are reluctant to get involved in Europe, at least in terms of providing arms or sustenance to the beleaguered countries that have been attacked by Germany or about to be attacked. He uses the word isolation, and he connects it to a plague. He talks about perhaps they're well-meaning, but they're ignorant. In other words, he goes on the attack very early on, the president of the United States. I hesitated, Professor, because one of the laws of politics I remember reading is you never punch down. Roosevelt started punching right away. Does he see Lindbergh as a major threat, as a political threat to him? Does he see Lindbergh as what some members of Congress suggest, a politician who could run for president?
I think that Roosevelt realized that there was sentiment on the Republican side to run Lindbergh against Franklin Roosevelt, perhaps in 1940. He was an attractive young man. He was an appealing candidate. He would have probably made a very plausible candidate. Lindbergh himself wouldn't have anything to do with it. He just said, no, I'm not in for politics. But Roosevelt recognized that even if Lindbergh did not go into politics, he might very well be an opponent, a hindrance to what Roosevelt wanted to accomplish. He understood that Lindbergh had the ear of the American people. There's something else that's really important to keep in mind. When this debate begins, and I do try to frame it as a debate, although Roosevelt and Lindbergh never shared a stage, and it wasn't Roosevelt says something and Lindbergh responds. They actually did it separated by a day or two. Roosevelt would give a speech, Lindbergh would give a speech. Then Roosevelt later would give a speech, Lindbergh would give a speech. So they're setting it up this way. And Roosevelt sort of wants to make sure that Lindbergh is not able to prevent Roosevelt from doing what he wants to do. But Roosevelt begins this debating period really with the odds against him, because on September 1st, 1939, Americans overwhelmingly believed that it would be a mistake for the United States to send troops to Europe again, the way it had the first time around. And so this is what Roosevelt has to deal with. He has to soften that opposition gradually. He, in retrospect, realized that Woodrow Wilson, president during World War I, had made a mistake by getting out in front of American public opinion and leading America into war. Roosevelt realized, no, he has to shape American public opinion, so American public opinion almost leads him into the war. If he gets too far out in front, then there will be a backlash the way there was against Woodrow Wilson. So Roosevelt really takes his time and allows the opinion to build. At this point, he is casting aspersions on his critics, including Lindbergh, but he's accusing them only of ignorance. Now, later on, he'll malign their motives as well. Here he thinks that they're well-meaning but wrong-headed, and things will change over time.
Norway ends Chamberlain. Winston Churchill is now prime minister. I said that their relationship is transactional. They want things from each other. Churchill writes, and the professor quotes many of the documents that Churchill sent to FDR that are both pleading and manipulative. It works, but FDR wanted to be convinced. The disaster at Dunkirk is not seen as a victory by Lindbergh. It's seen as, and his supporters in Congress, seen as vindication why we didn't want to get into this. We would have been trapped up against a beach as well. It's important now to note that following the disaster at Dunkirk comes the fall of France, and this is bitter fruit for everyone. Roosevelt, watching France fall apart as Britain is retreating to its island, expecting the worst that summer. I note, Professor, that Lindbergh goes on the radio again in June. June 15th is my note here, of 1940, to talk about the French fall. He's driving home the lesson again, aren't you glad we're in the war? He says that he has the public with him at that point. Is that assertion on his point accurate?
It's hard to say. Public opinion polling wasn't as well developed as it would become, but I think it's a fairly accurate sentiment, especially when it turns out that France can hold out against the Germans only for 6 weeks. They held out against the Germans for 4 years the first time around, but in 6 weeks, the new strategy of blitzkrieg takes them out. And Americans realize, oh boy, it's a good thing that we didn't have troops there, because they would have come in for the brunt of the punishment that the French did. And as the British flee back to their home island, Roosevelt is implored by the French and by Britain on behalf of the French, you have to give the French a promise that America will be there. And Roosevelt's not ready to do that at this point, because he's waiting for public opinion to be better prepared. And he also wants to see if the Allied side, the French, they've given up, if the British are going to fight. And this is where Churchill comes in, and as you point out, he tries to manipulate Roosevelt. There's, on the one hand, he's saying, we will fight on the beaches, we will fight in the roads, we will fight everywhere, we will never surrender. But he's telling Roosevelt, well, I might never surrender, but my government might fall. And the people who come after us, they might be forced to surrender. And so he says, basically, and so, Mr. President, you're going to have to deal with a very much worse situation if you let us go down. And by the way, we've got this fleet that if the Germans get their hands on, then America itself will be threatened. And so, dear Mr. President, please send us more weapons. And it works, because Roosevelt just weeks later announces that he's going to send to Britain several dozen American destroyers that had been in mothballs that are going to help the British stave off the German attack.
The book is America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. H.W. Brands is the author. It is now too late for France, and it might be too late for Britain. This is the summer of 40, when the Hitlerites unleashed the Luftwaffe to harass the British and destroy their airfields and terrorize the public, the burning of London. The CBS broadcaster Murrow makes this moment forever, because he broadcasts from the roofs of London and he watches the city burn. And at the time, it was understood that air power could not be stopped. At the time, it was understood that this is the end for us. They do not have our understanding, and indeed, there's still controversy whether air power is enough. Here in the 21st century, the collective opinion, it is not. It is a terror weapon, but it works to terrorize the public. and Lindbergh again appears to be in a position of strength. He's being wined and dined. I note that at one point, he and his wife have lunch or dinner with John Foster Dulles. Dulles' opinion of it at this moment, I know we're diverting, Professor, but it was a fascination. What was said at that dinner table? Can you imagine?
Yeah. So Lindbergh was certainly a darling among Republicans who hoped to displace Roosevelt. Now, while the Battle of Britain is going on, Franklin Roosevelt is making a historic decision to challenge the long-standing de facto rule against third terms for American presidents. And he does this by typically Rooseveltian misdirection. He refuses to say whether he's going to run or not. And by withholding a decision, he prevents other Democrats from putting themselves forward. Roosevelt tells a couple of his supporters, including James Farley, who was his postmaster general and his all-purpose political handyman, and his vice president, John Nance Garner. He leads them both to believe that they will get his blessing to become his successor for the 1940 campaign. But he doesn't make a decision. He keeps saying, well, these events overseas, they prevent us from rushing into anything until it's too late for them to develop any kind of momentum. They both feel betrayed. And the Democratic National Convention meets in the summer of 1940 with essentially no alternative to Roosevelt. So he has engineered this draft of himself for a third term, but he presents it as justified only by this emergency. And so for his critics, for this Roosevelt skeptics, including Lindbergh, they said this is exactly what we would expect of Roosevelt. Roosevelt is tending to his own political interest fully as much as to the interests of the United States. And in fact, Lindbergh predicts that if Roosevelt is given a third term, then he will run for a fourth term. He will probably die in office. And America will go from having a presidency that is in effect limited to a presidency for life. Now, your listeners will know that's exactly what happens. Roosevelt is elected a fourth time and does die in office. And so Lindbergh becomes ever more skeptical of Roosevelt, not simply on issues of foreign policy, where is he leading the United States, but on issues of Roosevelt's political power. What does this mean to the balance of power between Congress and the presidency? Lindbergh recognizes, and he warns in the speeches that he gives, that the president has a great deal of leeway to put the country into these positions where there seems to be only one avenue out, and that is the avenue that Roosevelt himself wanted.
A man named Robert Wood, a general from the First War, who's now head of Sears Roebuck, in other words, a plutocrat, connects with Lindbergh, and Lindbergh is asked to speak at the first of many rallies across the country, the Chicago rally, for what will now be formed as the America First Committee. I note notable names are showing up here. Benton and Bowles, the #1 advertising agency. We know that the radio networks are already sympathetic to Lindbergh. He has all the media, all the technology, all the money available to him that he could ask for. He's not being paid. He's not the leader, but he's the star speaker. This is summer 40, as Roosevelt's being nominated, as Roosevelt's campaigning, making remarks about, I promise you your son will not die in a foreign war. And Lindbergh at these speeches is saying the opposite. And there's no hostility except for one remark made by Burton Wheeler, which I thought was rough, Professor. Burton K. Wheeler. And he said, I promise you that your sons, every fourth son, will be plowed into the ground if we send another army to Europe. I'm paraphrasing it. Roosevelt is incensed, but I never can tell with Roosevelt what is the president and what is the man. Can you? He goes back and forth.
I will say that I have studied Roosevelt for years, and he is about the slipperiest character I've run across. So in all of this, I mean, I've got my two protagonists in this debate. I've got Lindbergh, and he's writing down his innermost feelings in his diary on a daily basis. So I know what Lindbergh is saying to himself. I know what Roosevelt is saying to other people. So he gives his speeches. He writes letters, especially he holds press conferences. And Roosevelt is a master of press conferences because he brings the reporters into his office. He brings the reporters onto his own turf. He treats them as essentially almost adjuncts to the administration. The rules of the press conferences in those days are you cannot quote the president without his express permission. And so Roosevelt can think out loud. He can bounce ideas off the reporters. And so they really feel like they've got an inside view on this. He's the ultimate backgrounder. And then when he wants to say something, he's saying, and you can quote me on that. And then they do. And so Roosevelt is telling them stuff. He's telling them what he wants them to believe, what he wants them to tell their readers. But what is Roosevelt actually saying to himself when he lies awake at night? What is he saying? I honestly don't know. I can tell you what he did. I can tell you what he's telling people, and I can try to infer from that what must have been going through his head. But there was nobody that Roosevelt really confided in. He didn't confide in his wife, Eleanor. He didn't confide. He would say various things to various people in the administration, but often he would say one thing to one member of the administration and another to another. So did Roosevelt himself know where all this was going? I'm not sure that he had a long-term plan. He was somebody who had really adept, really shrewd instincts for politics. So at any moment, he knew sort of what he wanted the next step to be. Did he step back and say, okay, 5 years from now, this is what I'm looking for? I'm not sure about that. He did intend to write his memoirs, but he didn't live to write them. So maybe the memoirs would have been more revealing, but maybe not. Maybe it would have been just sort of more of the same.
October 14th is a note here, 1940. Lindbergh's on the radio again speaking, and he always has the same message. It's not our war. We're secure here. We have two oceans. We have the best in aircraft. We have the best army. They won't come for us. And the American people are listening to this while Roosevelt is planning something that is called Lend-Lease. The book is America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. H.W. Brands is the author. These two men are as famous as the solar system as we begin 1941. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, having won his third term, making remarks that I will not send your son to die in a foreign war, knowing the whole time that the foreign war is beckoning the U.S. Our fleet is involved already, providing some comfort to so-called hemispheric defense, but really it's a question of helping the Brits. Our fleet is involved, certainly having been moved, the power of it to Hawaii. There's foreshadowing for you. In 1940 and 41, to hold off the Japanese who are making inroads directing at the British Empire. But we're keen on Congress now. The battle takes itself to the representatives. H.R. 1776, January 10th, 1941. What is that, Professor? Thank you.
So this presents to Congress what will be the Lend-Lease Act. There's a great irony here because H.R. 1776, of course, it's indicative of American independence, except 1776 was when America declared independence from Britain, said we're not British anymore, and we're separating ourselves from the British. But in fact, by this bill, Roosevelt intended to marry America's future to Britain's future. One of the parts of the neutrality legislation of the 1930s said that the United States will not extend loans to the belligerents. So if they could pay cash after the arms embargo was lifted, Roosevelt successfully got that removed, they still ran up against the problem of, can you pay for this stuff? And this was going to be a severe crimp because the war had gone on longer than people expected, and they'd burned through munitions much faster than people expected. And Winston Churchill was saying, we're going to run out of money. So in 1940, Roosevelt had arranged to give these destroyers to Britain, but in exchange for military bases. So Roosevelt was able to cast this as a hard-headed deal. We took advantage of Britain in Britain's hour of need, and he drove a hard bargain and he got this really good deal. But that wasn't enough. And so the British need more in the way of weaponry. Now, Roosevelt has an advantage during this. Roosevelt has an ally in his argument against Lindbergh and the other anti-war activists. And his ally was Winston Churchill. Because by this time, after you mentioned Edward R. Murrow and his broadcast of the Battle of Britain. So Americans are able to hear the British side of the story. There's nobody comparable who's broadcasting from Germany. And so the British are under attack. And Murrow was charmed by his British hosts, and he's able to convey this notion of the stubborn British, and they have this pluck in wartime, and they're really holding up well. And the bombs that are coming down are simply making them more determined to hold out for freedom and liberty and democracy. And so Americans have sentimentally moved to the side of the British. It's very clear in the minds of nearly everybody that the aggressor in this war is Germany, and the victim in this war so far is Britain. And so Americans have always liked to think of ourselves as being the defenders of the underdog, the defenders of the oppressed. And so Roosevelt's able to capture some of that, but he has to be careful. He can't go too far. He can't say that the British are about to collapse, because he's still making the argument that if we send weapons to Britain, we won't have to send soldiers to Britain. So he says, okay, what we're going to do if this bill passes is we're going to just open the gates of America's factories, of America's assembly lines, of everything. We will make sure that the British get everything they need, and we'll deal with the question of payment later. So lend, lease. Maybe we'll just lend it to them. Maybe, they'll give it back to us after the war. Or maybe we'll lease it to them, and maybe there will be some payments later. But we're not going to let Britain go down to defeat for lack of ready cash.
There is also a covert war. There is also an information war. And the professor guides me to something I had no knowledge of. I knew about William Donovan, who becomes famous as the head of the OSS, the CIA later on. I didn't know about a man named Stevenson, and Roosevelt did. And this is highly suggestive of falsehood in the Oval Office. I back up, Bill, because wow. Just wow. Who was Stevenson? William Stevenson.
Well, William Stevenson was the director of British propaganda in America. And the whole point was to move American public opinion to the side of Britain. And Stevenson and his crew, aided by William Donovan, who was his channel to Franklin Roosevelt, would use the usual techniques of propaganda, of planting unacknowledged stories, of arranging for rumors to appear and then appear to be confirmed by other rumors. And so to manipulate American opinion with the covert blessing of the administration of the United States, of the president. At a time when Roosevelt and his administration were complaining bitterly against the Germans for attempting to do the very same thing. So in this, it's really clear, and you mentioned the correspondence between Roosevelt and Churchill. This is all quite confidential. The American public doesn't know this is going on, doesn't know that Roosevelt has been planning with Churchill about how they're going to fight together should it come to that. And so Roosevelt has really sided with the British in a moral sense. And he tells Churchill, I'm trying to bring the American public around politically, but it's going to take time. But he also, in doing this, Roosevelt recognizes that the interests of Britain are not identical to the interests of the United States. Churchill is the most unreconstructed of British imperialists. And Britain, and Churchill is determined to defend the British Empire. Roosevelt has no desire to defend the British Empire, which means that Roosevelt is in this somewhat awkward position of saying if we send aid to Britain, we will be aiding democracy. And Lindbergh calls him out on this. He says, if we send aid to Britain, we're not aiding democracy, we're aiding imperialism. You're asking American soldiers to go and fight, perhaps, not yet the soldiers yet, but American aid, and they'll be followed by American soldiers who will go to defend British rule in India, for example. Is that something Americans really want to do?
The press conference you've mentioned, the mastery that Roosevelt has over the press. However, the document that he brought forth and wouldn't show the New York Times, cutting up Latin America into what you'd have to say were duchies, where the religious would be wiped out. The priests would be arrested and put in concentration camps. Everybody would have to read Mein Kampf and not the Bible. It didn't exist. There was no such thing from Germany. Did Roosevelt know it, that he'd been fed a lie?
This was probably a case where Roosevelt strongly suspected that the map was a forgery. There was no such German plan, but he didn't inquire too closely. So he wouldn't have known for a fact that this was a lie. And so he could present it and he'd say, we received this. And if somebody later were able to prove that it was a lie, he said, well, okay, we were misled. But he and the administration very quickly pulled it back and said, okay, no, we don't want anybody looking at this too closely. They were quite aware that this was a dodgy document and they didn't want anybody looking too closely into it.
The reason I emphasize this episode, which is, William Donovan was a trickster, I understand, is because there's inconsistently in Lindbergh's diary, I don't trust him. I don't trust what he says again and again. Lindbergh didn't have any evidence, but he had what? Intuition not to trust him? Or was that the Times? The Republicans would tell him that.
Well, he had intuition, and he also had the evidence that every time Roosevelt made a step away from neutrality, and he would say, but this is really to preserve a larger neutrality. That didn't happen because it was followed by another step that lessened neutrality even further. And so with Lend-Lease, when it was in fact approved by Congress, it was very clear to the world that the United States, at least in moral terms, was an ally of Britain. Britain was at war against Germany. And for the United States to have taken the position, for the President of the United States to have taken the position that on principle, the United States must assist Britain. Well, once you make it a matter of principle, then if the American material aid doesn't by itself keep Britain afloat, the American president is almost obliged to go further and to send troops. And this is where Lindbergh thought it all was going, and he thought it was by Roosevelt's design.
The book is America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. H.W. Brands is the author. This is like a drama, a play, in which the two principals each can take the stage alternately, and they're playing often to the same foils, the same chorus. This time it's Congress. Before it was the American people. The date I have is 1/15/41. Congressman Bloom invites Lindbergh to testify to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. The Senate, within 24 or 48 hours, the same invitation. And at the end, there's applause as Lindbergh stands up. He talks about what needs to be done to defend America. We don't need to send troops to Europe. Professor, at this point, I worried about Lindbergh. He's in over his head. Does he know it?
He's in over his head politically. He's beginning to realize that Roosevelt is really good at politics, of making things in politics happen the way he wants them to happen. Lindbergh recognizes that he's a bit of a babe in the woods politically, but he takes a certain pride in that very innocence or naivete because it means that he hasn't succumbed to the culture of politics in the way Roosevelt has. So he likes to think of himself as this person who stands aside and speaks the truth as he sees it without shading it in one direction or another. So that's the position that he takes. Now, he still gets a hearing in Congress because there are still opponents of Roosevelt. By this time, they're nearly all Republicans, and they have it against Roosevelt on partisan grounds as well as on policy grounds. And of course, in politics, it's always impossible to tease out entirely what's personal and what's political. But they bring Lindbergh forward, not because of his views on politics, but because of his expertise on matters of air warfare. And he is an expert on this. And one of the things that Lindbergh points out is that Roosevelt and the administration and the advocates of American intervention, they are taking the view that air power has made the world smaller. And look, they say, at how Germany has been able to inflict such damage on Britain from the air without landing a German soldier on British soil. And Lindbergh says, yeah, but that precisely proves the point. They inflicted all that damage, but they still could not land any troops on British soil. So air power has not changed warfare in the way the president is portraying. So Roosevelt is saying, and his supporters are saying, that air power makes America more vulnerable than it was before. And Lindbergh says that's precisely wrong. Just the opposite has happened. America is more defensible now because of air power than it was before. Because, he said, if anybody's going to invade the United States, they have to bring an armada of ships filled with troops. They will land on American shores. Before airplanes, those ships could very well get within sight of American shores before we could defend ourselves. Now, with the right kind of aircraft, we can attack them 300 miles off American shores. America is more defensible, says Lindbergh, today in the day of air power than it was before. And Roosevelt is telling you just the opposite because he wants the United States to go to war in Europe. And this is wrong. And Lindbergh makes the case that those who are calling him and others like him isolationists, they're actually quite wrong, because he didn't intend to isolate America. In fact, he had this very sophisticated and robust vision of hemispheric defense. The frontier of America, he said, is not on the Rhine River, as Franklin Roosevelt seems to be portraying it. It is 200 miles off American shores. And we will build air bases on America's coast, and we will build them in Latin America. We will build them in Canada, even if the Latin Americans and the Canadians resist. The Western Hemisphere is our hemisphere. We will defend it. We will defend it broadly, and we will defend it robustly. And so no enemy will ever dare to come near our shores. That's where America's security lies, says Lindbergh.
Lindbergh continues to meet with the people at large rallies. Thousands appear in the evening. I wrote some details about them. The Manhattan Center, April of 41, in which he tells the audience that Britain is losing the war, or conveys that sentiment. This is, and he calls for his adversaries, he calls them interventionists and defeatists. This is rough language to go after the President of the United States. Again, Professor, I worried. I said, no, for heaven's sakes, pull back. You're going too far. We know this is headed to catastrophe. So I had 2020, thanks to you. The St. Louis rally in May of 41, the rally in New York City at the Madison Square Garden. We note that recently. Very, very, very popular. And there's some vanity in the diary. He notes the number of people turned out, but especially the number of people who couldn't get in waiting outside. Did you detect that? You've read the whole diary.
Yeah.
That there's some attention to how popular I am. We have about a minute.
Yeah, there certainly is an aspect of that. And again, just as there was the personal combined with the political in Roosevelt, there was in Lindbergh. Now, in Lindbergh, the political doesn't take the form of wanting to run for office, but he professes to be opposed to politics, but he steps into the political arena and people respond. And they cheer when he gives his message. And so it's gratifying in that regard. He can think they like me, but he can also say they agree with my message. And this is the position that he takes. The American interest is foremost here. Of course, Roosevelt's taking the same position, but on the opposite side of the question.
America first, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the shadow of war. A warm night in late May, 1941. Roosevelt going on the radio. The speech that he makes, the remarks that he makes, so in the frame of the fireside chats, and yet this is a call to action. In this, his voice is so dominating, they stop baseball games. The actors in Washington stop the play. They freeze it and wait because they pipe in his words. Everywhere in America, they're listening to him. Remember, there's no TV, there's no iPhone, there's the radio, which is modern technology. And it's live, there's no recordings. And what he has to say is extremely unhappy making, unlimited national emergency. What does that mean, Professor? What is it that FDR wanted to achieve that night? Because he scared everybody.
So the first thing he wants to do is to ramp up the production of arms. And the production of arms will be to send more arms to Britain, but also to have more arms for the United States. At this point, he is saying, well, America may need to defend itself if attacked. But he's also thinking America needs to be prepared to go on the attack, to go into war in Europe. And so a national emergency is putting American industry on a wartime footing, but also putting the American mind, the American people on a wartime footing. They're, okay, prepare for war. Until this point, Roosevelt has taken the position that the war is over there, and he's going to do his best to keep the war over there. But now he's preparing Americans for the fact that that war over there might become America's war. He doesn't quite know how it's going to happen. He's beginning to figure out, to plan how he can arrange to make it happen. But this is moving America another large step toward war. He's making it very clear, clearer than ever, that the United States is heart and mind with the British. The United States will not allow Britain to be defeated. And therefore, Americans, be ready for this. And this is why, as you say, the baseball games are stopped, the movie theaters stopped. So everybody realizes it's essentially a declaration of moral war. It's not yet a declaration of actual war, but Roosevelt has taken the decision, we are on the side of Britain essentially to the end.
Again, Lindbergh is traveling the country, making presentations of the message of America First. I have Madison Square Garden. I have Philadelphia. They had to move the hall because they were anxious about whether the people who had the hall were anxious whether they were being un-American in sponsoring America First after that unlimited national emergency declaration by the president. June in, oh yes, the Hollywood Bowl filled to capacity on 6/20. I note that there is a suggestion in the diary, and there's more of it in your reporting, Professor, that at this point, America First was seen as unsavory is too strong a word. Suspect. Is that in the news?
Yes, definitely suspect. And indeed, this because members of the Roosevelt administration, including obliquely Roosevelt himself, are casting Lindbergh and the America First Committee as disloyal to the United States because Roosevelt has declared this emergency, and it's very clear this is emergency on behalf of Britain. And so Roosevelt now is sort of about to go nuclear, so to speak, against his opponents. Before this time, he has called them silly and foolish and wrong-headed. Now he is calling them disloyal. And he's using imagery from the Civil War. He talks about the Copperheads. And these were Northerners who sympathized with the Confederacy. And he talks about fifth columnists. This is a term from the Spanish Civil War, about this enemy within. And at this point, Lindbergh particularly feels that Roosevelt has gone way too far because the United States is not at war, and therefore it's not disloyal to the United States to take an opinion in opposition to the opinion of the President of the United States. But Roosevelt seems to be moving in the direction of essentially criminalizing that. And here, Lindbergh certainly had memories of his father, because his father indeed was chased by the Justice Department for criticizing Woodrow Wilson. Now, that was a different moment. That was after the United States had gone into the war. So when the country is at war, then you can talk about, well, you can utter the treason word. But before the country goes to war, there is no such thing as treason. But Lindbergh and the America First people are being called traitors. They're being called disloyal to the United States. So Roosevelt seems to want to have the advantages of wartime in suppressing dissent before there's a war.
J. Edgar Hoover, FBI, principals in some fashion solving the kidnapping and murder of the child, little Lindy. However, FBI directed by the president, we can presume. Maybe there's a memo somewhere to tap the phones of the America First Committee. William Stevenson, that's special operations as MI6. Think of him as a Bond type. He rents a radio station, WRUL, 50,000 watts, which is big, maybe 100,000, and dominates the airwaves with, you'd have to say, misdirection about the America First Committee. He has agents who hand out handbills and start fistfights maybe at America First Committee gatherings. All of this is going very poorly for Lindbergh. Then the president makes what appears to be a mistake, but I can't tell. The Greer, Professor, that odd incident where the president presented the situation as attacked by a German submarine. None of that was true. Was that a risk for FDR, or could he get away with this?
He could get away with it because he understood that things were moving swiftly. And by the time the Navy conducted an investigation,
right,
the United States would probably be at war. And the minor discrepancy between his story, so the Greer was cooperating with British warships, with British submarines, and they were chasing German submarines. Roosevelt was saying the United States is not at war, but the Greer, in fact, was engaged in what amounted to this joint venture in the middle of the Atlantic. And the Greer was fired upon, and Roosevelt said it was fired on unprovoked. Well, from the German perspective, it was entirely provoked. And Roosevelt knew that if there was an investigation, then this would turn up. But he figured that events would have outrun the awkwardness that created, which in fact indeed is what happened.
Because we're of a generation, Professor, I did think about Tonkin Gulf. Right?
Oh, you bet. And this is exactly what Lindbergh had been predicting. The president will essentially engineer an incident like this, where it's going to happen far away, and the only witnesses are going to be people who are sworn to obey the orders of the president. And America will be led to war by the design of the president.
For the boomers, Tonkin Gulf is the Vietnam War. We go now to 9/11, 1941, when the president makes his remarks about the Greer. That night, by coincidence, by fate, remember this is a drama written by an unknown author, Mr. Lindbergh is in Des Moines, Iowa to make a presentation for the America First Committee. And whatever inspires Lindbergh that night betrays him. He goes too far and he ruins himself and the America First Committee forever. I first learned about the America First Committee flipping through Life magazines when I was a teenager and coming across a photograph in which Life framed Lindbergh and the America First Committee as Hitlerites, as fifth columnists, as betrayers. That was later. Right now, the remarks, Professor, what does he say that makes him forever on the other side of virtue?
Lindbergh contends that there are three groups who are trying their best to get the United States involved in a war with Germany. The first group he identifies is Britain. Lindbergh was vaguely aware of William Stevenson and what the British were doing. And of course, the British were doing it openly as well. And he said, it is perfectly understandable that Britain should want the United States to get involved in the war against Germany. It would be of great material help if the United States did. So that's group number one. Group number two, he said, is Jewish Americans. He said it's perfectly understandable, given what we know about what the Nazis have done to Jews in Germany and Poland, that Jewish Americans should feel sympathy for their co-religionists, for their fellow people, and that they would want the United States to get involved in a war. And he said that there's a powerful Jewish lobby in the United States. And then he said that the third group is the Roosevelt administration. And although Lindbergh said it was understandable that the British and American Jews should be in favor of this, he said that the actions of the Roosevelt administration were less excusable because Roosevelt was doing this primarily for political gain. So, and the speech went on for a considerable period of time, but the one thing that everybody caught up on the next day was the fact that Lindbergh mentioned American Jews. And this allows Lindbergh's enemies to say, see, we told you, he speaks exactly like Nazi propaganda. In fact, Roosevelt himself and Roosevelt's advisors, they said, we don't have to say anything more. That's exactly what the German propaganda office would have said. And Lindbergh is branded an anti-Semite. He's branded a Nazi stooge. And essentially, he has made himself too hot to handle politically. He goes to Herbert Hoover, the former president, and he says, what did I say that was wrong? And Hoover says, it's not that what you said was wrong. You were simply wrong to say it because you've taken yourself to a place that is politically out of bounds. And in fact, the America First Committee then distanced itself from Lindbergh. And very shortly, the American First Committee has to disband.
I note that there were rallies after that. There was one in Madison Square Garden, I believe, New York City, early October. Is there, in the diary, is there an understanding Lindbergh that he's gone too far, that he can't get back?
Lindbergh lets the members of the America First Committee know that if they think that he should stop speaking, he'll stop speaking. He said, I'm not going to take back what I said. I still stand by what I said, but I recognize that it may be counterproductive at this point. Now, one of the reasons, the principal reason that Lindbergh said what he said was he realized that he and the America First Committee were losing the debate, that Roosevelt had engineered things so that war was imminent. And Lindbergh writes in his diary before he gives a speech, I don't know if I should say this. I know it's going to create a firestorm, but this horrible thing is going to happen if I don't. And so I at least have to give it a try. But what this does is not simply for that period, because it's not long after this, that the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. And so at that point, the United States is in the war. And so Lindbergh didn't have much of a shelf life left for speaking. And he realized that things were coming to a head. And so that's why he took this, what he considered to be a desperate move and a risky move.
Professor H.W. Brands, America First is his new book, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. I read from the professor's manuscript. Mr. President, what's this about Japan? Churchill said as he called Roosevelt. It's quite true, Roosevelt replied. They have attacked us at Pearl Harbor. We're all in the same boat now. Churchill says, this certainly simplifies things. Professor, the story was about Europe. They're now attacked by Japan, which I believe at one point the prime minister referred to as you'll take care of the dog Japan for us.
Yes.
So I've always wondered about those 4 days between the 8th of December when Roosevelt asked for a declaration of war and the 8th when Hitler declares war. What happened in Germany?
So this is one of those great what if moments in history, because the debate over American entry into the war was 95% about American entry into the European war. Now, in hindsight, we think of this as World War II, but in those days, these are two separate wars. And Roosevelt has quietly been putting pressure upon Japan, thinking that, okay, we have to prevent Japan from expanding throughout the Pacific part of Asia. But there was an alliance that linked Germany to Japan. And so Roosevelt saw that connection. And anyway, so the Japanese decide for their own reasons that they're going to attack the United States because the United States has essentially delivered an ultimatum saying you have to pull out of Indonesia, you have to end the war in China. And the Japanese aren't going to do it. They're going to, in fact, expand the war. They know that will mean war against the United States, and they want to land the first blow. America won't be expecting it in Hawaii, and so it'll work. So the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt is surprised by the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, not particularly surprised by a Japanese attack. He thought it would be somewhere else. So that was a surprise. And of course, Congress immediately has no choice but to declare war against Japan. But that puts Roosevelt in this awkward position. The war he wanted was the war against Germany. And now the United States is at war against Japan. And potentially this makes a war against Germany less likely because who in Congress would want to multiply America's problems by declaring a whole separate war? And so Roosevelt is waiting to see what's going to happen. And then 72 hours later, Hitler does Roosevelt a favor by declaring war on the United States. Why did he do it? Well, part of it was Hitler's belief that he and Germany and the German army could carry all before it. He saw what Roosevelt was doing in the Atlantic. He knew that Roosevelt was itching for a cause of war, and he was morally certain I hesitate to use the word moral reflected in the context of Hitler, but he was certain that Roosevelt would find an occasion to declare war against Germany. So he decides, well, if there's going to be war, we might as well declare it, take the initiative and show we're not afraid of the Americans. And so he does. And it's at that point that things do indeed get simplified, because now the United States and Britain are in the same war together. And it's at that point, by the way, that these two separate wars become World War II. And it's also worth noting that for Germany, there was just the European theater. For Japan, there was just the Asian theater. For the United States, there were two theaters. I should add here, too, that for the Soviet Union, there was only one theater until the very end of the war.
The other phone call, same day. Lindbergh to Wood, Robert Wood, former General Sears Roebuck. Well, he got us in through the back door. That was his remark as he opened that phone call, talking about Pearl Harbor.
Yes. So
what happens after that is history making. Lindbergh wants to participate in some fashion, but who gives the order to get rid of him?
Lindbergh takes the position that it was his right as an American citizen. He thought it was his responsibility as an American citizen to speak his mind against the war before the war began. But once the United States is at war, he says, I am a loyal American citizen. My country is at war. I have skills that I can provide on behalf of my country. So he volunteers to join the Army Air Corps. And Roosevelt says no. The last thing Roosevelt wants is for Lindbergh, having been his chief critic, to go off and become a military hero. But the way it was couched was that Roosevelt didn't talk directly with Lindbergh. Lindbergh talked to people in the Defense Department, Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War. And Stimson himself is somewhat skeptical that Lindbergh can be as loyal as officers ought to be, since he's been such a critic of Roosevelt. And at the very least, he might be perceived as having been disloyal. I think the Roosevelt administration had been calling him a fifth columnist, a copperhead, disloyal. So it would be difficult for them to say, now follow Colonel Lindbergh and do what he says, because, okay, who knows? And people in the administration have been calling him a Nazi sympathizer, a Nazi fellow traveler. Well, you don't want somebody like that in a position of command. But I think the main thing was that he didn't want to hear anything more from Lindbergh. Now, what Lindbergh does is he signs on with airplane manufacturers as a consultant, and surreptitiously he goes out to the Pacific to test the planes and show the pilots how to fly them. And while he's out there, he flies some combat missions against the Japanese on his own.
Right. He dies in 1972, 74. I remember New York Times feature after feature upon his death. He died in Hawaii. The book is America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. Professor H.W. Brands is the author. And the professor and I have not attended to the analogies to today, but they're everywhere in the book. Enjoy. I'm John Batchelor.